Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub. Thank you for a very special edition of L'Chaim joining me. Very often I have the pleasure of introducing you to people you may not have met, and sometimes I'm meeting them for the first time as well. Then there are times when I get the extraordinary pleasure of introducing to you someone who is very dear to me. And that's who's sitting with me on this edition of L'Chaim. Way back when I was really a young kid starting out.
And so was I.
It's true. We were both young at one time,
yes, Yes.
And I was doing L'Chaim on radio, and I went to a man who I respected already enormously, but he was a big shot. I'm starting out, I'm nobody. And I go to Rabbi Shlomo Riskin and I ask him if he'll be on our panel of commentators and be someone I can turn to on a regular basis for L'Chaim. He says, of course. And there are so many times you let me come. I would schlep my little machine, and sometimes you'd come to the apartment where we were taping, and you'd sit with Gene Borowitz and whoever it was, you'd sit and we would talk, and you would share insight and wisdom. And I thought you were making an extraordinary contribution through Lincoln Square. Then when you moved to Israel through Efrat, you have made a major contribution in so many ways that you can also make it on Shalom TV. It gives me enormous pleasure. And thank you for making time for me now and sitting with me now.
Pleasure.
Here we are, and as you and I are sitting, Operation Protective Edge continues. The way it is being handled in the media is something that troubles me. I'd like to know if you've seen it and it troubles you. And right now as we're meeting, coincidentally, we have just heard, you and I, that the ground offensive has been launched. I was hoping, to be honest, that Israel wouldn't need to do it. I believe that Hamas very much wanted to suck Israel in, but that's a non-Israeli perspective. So Shlomo Riskin, begin. What's your whole feeling about the conflict that Israel is now in with Hamas?
It's a horrific thing. And I think that part of it, frankly, is because of the world and the world's reaction when Mahmoud Abbas made a partnership with Hamas, and no one in the world said a word, not even our ally America. And that sort of gave the green light for Hamas to be Hamas. And still no one is saying anything. And still they're getting our tax dollar, American tax dollar. And there's no excuse for it, there's no justification for it.
I've been saying that, number one, every civilized nation should be condemning Hamas daily. And even today as we're sitting, there's a big story in the New York Times about how 4 Palestinian kids were victims of a rocket attack that hit them on the beach. And my own feeling is, first of all, I don't know any Israeli who's not, we don't want this to happen. No Israeli wants this to happen. Nobody's rejoicing at the fact that these Palestinian kids are sometimes the victims here. But this is what I want the headline to read. I want this headline, Shlomo. Hamas causes 4 more deaths. It's not Israel who made those deaths. The only reason Israel is in Gaza at all is an attempt to stop, in a defensive action, Hamas rockets from raining down inside Israel. The Israeli attacks would stop instantly. All Hamas has to do is stop firing into Israel, and those kids would still be alive.
And it's much worse than that even. Because we warned the populated centers that we now have to go in because we have to destroy the military caches. Hamas leadership is telling them not to leave, but to stay. They are truly responsible for all of the casualties that are going on there. And by the way, it's a horrific word in English, casualty. There's nothing casual about a death like this. It's a word that really shouldn't be used. It should be expunged from our vocabularies. But you're right on. Hamas is responsible for all of the Hamas people, civilians who are being killed, not Israel. We were given no choice by them.
Of course.
We have to protect our own citizenry.
Okay. I've asked this of others. I want to hear your answer. So why? Why isn't the story reported in what you and I would consider to be a truthful and objective way? Why is it slanted so that the context is never reported? Israel becomes the bad guy, and the world is now saying, Israel, how can you do this to, the Palestinian civilian population? Why is it happening this way?
Unfortunately, that's the anti-Semitism in the world.
It's that simple.
The world has not learned anything at all from the Holocaust. Nothing at all.
Doesn't that pain you?
It pains me tremendously.
Does it surprise you?
But it doesn't surprise me.
Okay, we're different. It shocks me. I guess I was naive. I really thought there would be a lesson learned, and that the emergence of the State of Israel, which came out of the world's understanding of what the Jew had to bear throughout history. I really thought in Western Europe, in France, in England, Shlomo, I never expected the kind of anti-Semitism I'm seeing there. And you're saying you were?
Europe is Islamabad. This was the world in the late 1930s. The world. That's exactly how they responded. Hitler, Yimach Shemo v'Zichro, waited always. He started in small steps. Kristallnacht was a small step. No one was murdered. No one was killed. Storefronts were damaged. He saw the world did nothing, said nothing, no reaction, and therefore he upped the ante. And he himself was shocked at how quickly all the various governments and people were willing to be his partners in destroying Jews. I think, there's a midrash that says that at Mount Sinai, Sin'ah, the hatred for the Jewish people, was born. And I think the Bible is saying something very important. In the history of the world, from the pre-Sophists to now, postmoderns, there were only two ideologies, very antithetical ideologies, about what the human being is. There were Rome, Sparta, that fundamentally saw the human being as a complex animal. And therefore, just like in the animal world, as Darwin put it so very well, survival of the fittest, the strongest survives. And they see the world in very simple terms. Those who are weak deserve to be killed. Those who are strong, to the victor belong the spoils. We came to the world with a totally different notion. Human being created in the image of God. Human being totally inviolate. Human being cannot be damaged. And that compassionate righteousness and moral justice will trump might. Right will triumph over might. That's our view. Different view. Fundamentally different. But the world is not ready for that view and doesn't want to hear that view. And the world also doesn't want to say, I'm sorry for what happened in the Holocaust. And they're thrilled when they can point a finger and say, you Jews are not better than anybody else. But I want to tell you something. Today, and I was very proud of Israel. The family of Mohammed al-Khadir,
This is the Palestinian teen who was murdered by Israelis.
And that Palestinian family has been put in the same category in Israel as any of the Jews, Israelis, who are murdered in a terrorist attack.
He was designated a terrorist victim.
Exactly.
Even though the terrorism was perpetrated by Jews. Israel gives him that status and his family that status. It's remarkable.
And that's what makes Israel special.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what the world doesn't understand and is afraid to understand and would much rather condemn us because they're not ready to espouse our morality.
All right, I want you now to speak to the general issue that underlies the debate. And you're going to do this from Efrat. There are some people who, when Palestinian spokespersons go on American television, this is what they say. Yes, it's unfortunate that Hamas has to fire rockets, but it has to fire rockets because it's under occupation and it's being oppressed by a mighty Israeli nation, which is not giving Palestinians not only their human rights, is not recognizing their right to the land. And that the discussion always comes around to, has Israel in some way taken something that doesn't belong to them? And I want to comment from a book that has gotten a lot of attention here in the United States. It's only recently been translated into Hebrew, My Promised Land by Ari Shavit, in which he says the following, Shlomo. My great-great-grandfather came to Palestine on a mission for Theodor Herzl to scout out the land. And when he came, he was impressed by the opportunity there was here in then Palestine for a place for the Jews. But my grandfather never saw that there were Arabs there. And then he writes this comment. If my great-grandfather had seen, he would have had to go back. Why would he have had to go back? Because he would have realized that the Jewish presence in Palestine could only be accomplished if a people is destroyed and their land is taken. The fundamental cradle of My Promised Land is, we stole their land. You are in Efrat, which is on the West Bank, Judea, Samaria. Many people are very upset that there are settlements outside the Green Line. I want you to speak to the two issues here. One, how do you answer for yourself and the people who live in Efrat and for the Jewish people as a whole? Did the Jewish people take someone else's land to make Eretz Yisrael? And how do you feel now about leading a community which is in the settlement block around Jerusalem on the eastern side of the Green Line on the West Bank?
Tragically, and Ari Shavit should know much better. Tragically, this nonsense of occupied territory is just nonsense. From a historical perspective, it holds no water whatsoever. I'm going to try to be very brief. I want to explain this as quickly as I can, but it's a critically important thing, I believe, for everyone to understand very well. First of all, it is not we who do not recognize the right of Palestinians on the land. It's the Palestinians who do not recognize our right on the land. The land is what I would call disputed territory. That's what it has been for 2,000 years. Not disputed with the Palestinians. That could only be the 8th century when the Muslim was born and lived here. But the situation is as follows. Number one, there have always been Jews living in Israel in an unbroken chain for 4,000 years.
Unbroken chain.
Unbroken chain. There were even Jews who remained during the Babylonian exile. There were Jews who remained living in Israel. There have always been Jews living here. We have always seen this land as our homeland. We've said L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim every Passover Seder night, every Yom Kippur night, and every wedding. So this is fundamentally a country that we have never given up, even though we were chased out from pillar to post. Now, for approximately 400 years before the First World War, the one who took ownership over the land by force was the Ottoman Empire, Turkey plus. That was the last vestige of power of the Ottoman Empire. The First World War was fought, won by the Allies, basically England and America. America was then called Great Satan. That's when Al-Qaeda was really born. And the Treaty of Versailles was written and signed. The Treaty of Versailles also incorporated the Balfour Declaration. And the Treaty of Versailles called for 18 Arab states, secular Arab states, because they understood very well what religious Arab states meant. Wahhabi Islam has taken over Islam. But 18 Arab states and one Jewish state on both sides of the Jordan River, from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River, which would give us very clear boundaries. That's not the biblical contract that I also believe in very deeply and profoundly, but that's the Treaty of Versailles. From 1918 until 1947, not 18 Arab states were formed, but 22 Arab states. And they weren't really Arab states. Warring tribes were put together in a hodgepodge sort of way. England had the mandate. Most of what she gave because she wanted to get oil in return in some way, fashion or form. No Jewish state was formed. The truth is, no Palestinian state was formed either, but there were other Muslim states. November 29th, 19...
One second. What happens in 1922 to the land on the eastern side of the Jordan River?
The eastern side of the Jordan River, that's very good. The eastern side of the Jordan River, it was decided because, as far as Saudi Arabia was concerned, there was a battle between the House of Saud and the House of Hashem. The House of Saud won. England wanted to give something to the House of Hashem because they also had oil. So England decided to give to the House of Hashem Jordan, the east side of the Jordan River. Now this was supposed to go to us. So they called in Chaim Weizmann with a number of Arab countries, and they all signed off, including Chaim Weizmann. He would give up the east side of the Jordan in return for being accepted by the entire Arab world with open arms. And by the way, this Transjordan state was ratified only by England and Pakistan. It was never a full vote. In the meantime, the West Bank was supposed to be ours. It was to wait many more years until November 29th, 1947, when the United Nations, pinpricks after the Holocaust, no question, said it's about time to give Israel something. And roughly, they divided the whole area that was left, the West Bank, about 80% to the Palestinians, 20% to the Jews. We accepted. They rejected. And that was the beginning of our war of independence. We won that war. And we won more areas than we had gotten originally. And we were living under difficult conditions. It's what Rabbi even called Auschwitz lines. But we were living, and we were ready to live that way. I came here for the first time in 1960-61. There were almost constant Fedayeen raids killing Israelis, but we managed. And then in 1967, the Arab world wanted to push us into the sea. And they started the Six-Day War. They strangled the Straits of Tiran, an act of war internationally. That was the only way we could export and import from Asia. They made it impossible for us to do that. The Six-Day War began, and we won a lightning victory. And we won land that we had been promised before by the Treaty of Versailles. So we didn't occupy anybody's territory. They were occupying our territory. Even given that, the year 2005, Prime Minister said very clearly he's ready to give up 94% of the West Bank in exchange for peace. We have always, since the beginning of this conflict, been willing to share. They have never been willing to share. And please, I would ask Ari Shavit to get in touch with his grandfather and to hear from his grandfather's own lips, because that was Herzl's position, and I'm sure that was his grandfather's position. This was our land before anyone ever dreamt of living here. Mm-hmm. We were here first, and we were here always. The riots in Hebron in 1926 and 1939, the riots in Hebron, we were living in Hebron. We're the only people who have the grave sites of an ancestor from 4,000 years ago, Abraham and Sarah. We were chased from Hebron. What do you mean we don't have the right to be here? And this is treaty after treaty. I want to say one more thing. The New York Times loves to talk against the settlements. Well, we unilaterally left the settlements in Gaza. Unilaterally. The United Nations gave us the right. That's 242 that no one remembers. The United Nations understood that there's a good international legal position. And Justice Edmund Levy, may his soul rest in peace, expressed it very clearly and I think very cogently, that the entire West Bank should go to us because it was in the Treaty of Versailles and a war of aggression against us that wanted to destroy us, and we gained it in war. We should own it. Nevertheless, we've always said we're willing to share in the interest of peace. The Arab world has never even said that we have a right to the Temple Mount. They deny history, and they deny history with a straight face. I was on television once with an imam from Egypt talking about our right to the Temple Mount. The imam said on public television, millions of viewers, the imam said, everyone knows that Al-Aqsa Mosque was there before Abraham was born. Now, how do you go against such a ridiculous, ahistorical kind of comment? But this is what the world is being fed, and unfortunately, because no one is learning history anymore, this is what the world has accepted. At any rate, in 2005, Arik Sharon said, we will unilaterally leave Gaza. The United Nations gave us the task of administering the territories and coming to a peace agreement with the Palestinians. We began to see how difficult it was to come to a peace agreement with the Palestinians. Arik Sharon said, so let's leave unilaterally. We don't want to control the West Bank. We don't want to control Arabs who don't want to be controlled by us. What we want is our place in the sun. What we want is secure borders for Israel. What we want is as much of Judea and Samaria as we are entitled to. At any rate, 2005, we left Gaza, saying in effect to the Gazans and the Palestinians, now take it and let this be the beginning of your state. Well, what happened, you know, that Wolfenson, the head of the International Bank, paid $14 million, I believe, to Israel. We had turned the Gaza, which is now a swamp, into a Garden of Eden. We had hothouses that employed 10,000 Gazan Arabs, gave them real jobs, and we exported vegetables and flowers all over the world. And, well, it doesn't exist anymore because it was burnt to the ground in an act of self-destruct by the Palestinians. And the Hamas immediately fought Fatah, won, and started to send rockets into Ashdod, Ashkelon, Sderot. So the settlements are something that we have only because we need it for self-protection. There's no trust between us because of all the incidents I've just mentioned now. But we have not occupied anyone else's territory. We've come back home. And before I moved 1 inch into Efrat, every piece of land was checked out by the Supreme Court and the Lands Authority to make sure that there was no Palestinian who can claim it. We've bent over backwards to be as fair as possible and to enable the sharing of the land. The other side has been intransigent.
That is wonderfully said. I want you to tell one story you've told me before, but I want it here. At one point, Efrat had a wonderful relationship with a neighboring.
We still
Arab.
have.
You still do?
A wonderful relationship.
Okay, but you told me a story about a Palestinian leader, and you ultimately went to see him, and he told you 3 things, 1, 2, 3. Tell that story again.
Good. We have had a wonderful relationship with the Arabs, the Palestinians. By the way, that's what makes me optimistic.
You still are optimistic?
I still am optimistic.
Despite it all?
Despite it all, because people to people, they're very good people. Wadi Nis, Jort Hashama, Wad Rahal, these are the villages near Efrat. We've had 30 years of true friendship. They've gone to my weddings and I've gone to theirs. They come to my shivas, unfortunately, and I go to theirs. And we help each other, we work together, and they have a wonderful work ethic. People to people, they want peace like I want peace. They have a very unfortunate leadership. Now, the story you're talking about is this relationship. There's one wonderful person from Wadi Nis, Sami, one of many, many, who has bought all of the leavening, all of the chametz from Efrat for the last 30 years. I'm sorry, Daoud. He's the father. Daoud is the one. His son, Sami, wanted very much to go to medical school. And his father spoke to me about it. Abu Ali is the Mukhtar of Wadi Nis. We have a wonderful relationship. I said to Abu Ali, let's send Sami to medical school. We'll pay 50%, you pay 50%. And that's what we did. That's what happened.
But wait, you do share, you do help medically. There is a certain kind of sharing between you and some of the Arab villages, correct?
Yes. In other words, look, we have the largest, I think Efrat has the largest percentage of medical doctors of any other place in Israel, or probably the world.
The world, right.
So our doctors are very kind. The Arabs don't have any kind of insurance, unfortunately. and we try to be very helpful. If they have an emergency, a medical emergency, they call me in the middle of the night. And we really try to be very helpful. So I felt we shouldn't be paternalistic. Now they have a young man getting out of medical school. Let him start a small clinic. And that would be fine. The simple kinds of things he'll be able to take care of, and he had a partner in mind that he would work with, and they would have their own little clinic, and if there were difficult issues, they would come to the doctors in Efrat. I went to one of my strong supporters, Danny Abraham, of Slim Fast fame, and he lives in Palm Beach. I spoke to him, and I asked if he would help for this. He immediately gave me $250,000. He said, it's a wonderful, wonderful program you're thinking about. Very much in favor. And there'll be much more money if it's successful. Let's start with this. I went to our doctors. They translated the $250,000 into the emergency equipment that would be necessary. And I thought it was the end of the story. 2 days later, all the equipment was in front of my house, given back. And I discovered that everyone I dealt with was put into prison. And they were put into prison by a person from the Palestinian National Council, Salah Ta'amri, who at that time was the Tsar of Bethlehem. And a powerful figure at that time. Now he's not so powerful anymore. But then he was a powerful figure, close to Arafat. And he didn't want to do anything. No cooperation. The young men were released from prison, thank God. I must have made 50 calls to try to get to see him because I had a relationship with him. He was a star at one time of the Palestinian world. He was a terrorist, and he was imprisoned after the Lebanon War. But he became a Judeophile. He has a perfect English. He studied in Oxford or Cambridge, the British poets. His master's, I think, is on the British poets, I believe Yeats. And he has a palatial residence right near Tekoa, which is not far from us. He's married to the former Queen Dinah, the wife of King Hussein, who passed away from Jordan. And I had a very wonderful evening conversation with him about the British poets. So I felt I knew him, and I felt there was a spark of humanity that I thought I recognized. So I tried very hard to get to meet him. It took a telephone call from Danny Abraham to Arafat to make a meeting possible. I walked up the rickety steps in Bethlehem. At every landing, there was a picture, a painting of people with hooked noses and beards and kippot beating on little Arab kids. The highest landing was a caricature of Sharon, a big cauldron of chicken soup, and the Knedlach were Arab babies that he was eating. I got a little nervous, I didn't have a gun. Salah Ta'amri ushers me into his office. "You're the ugly Israeli I met once." I said, "Yes, maybe that's what I am. But I'm also a rabbi and a humanitarian. And I care very much about the Israelis." Now this is 1994, 1995. I care very much about the Palestinians, and I want them to have medical help. He said to me, "You care about the Palestinians? Then first get out of Efrat. then get out of Jerusalem, and then get out of Tel Aviv. So I said, I don't understand. This is Oslo. Aren't we at peace? He said, don't be a fool. You know we're at war. I said, but you know, you were always one of my heroes. You wrote a book together with an Israeli reporter. My enemy, my friend. You were the one who really first, within the Arab world, spoke about a two-state solution. What happened? He looked at me hard. And he said, you really want to know what happened? That was when I believed that we would lose. And therefore I offered a two-state solution. But since I'm certain now that we're going to win, no two-state solution. And then he stood closer to me. And he said, and you know what made me believe that you're going to lose and we're going to win? I used to work out, he said, in the prison courtyard. And one particular day, I saw the prison guard, the Israeli prison guard, eating a pita and falafel. And I went over to him, and I said to him, because, you know, I began to read a lot about Judaism. And I said, you know, it's the fourth day of Passover. How can you eat pita and falafel on the fourth day of Passover? You aren't allowed to eat bread or leavening. And the Israeli prison guard said, I don't give a damn what any book says, written 4,000 years ago, what I can eat and what I cannot eat. And Salach Ta'amri, I'm quoting him word for word, said, I then had an epiphany. Because if the Jews in Israel don't really care about what the Bible says about not eating leavening on Passover, they're not going to care about what the Bible says about Israel either. And if you don't really believe that Israel is your land, you won't stay here, because we don't want you here. I walked out of his office trembling. Thank God I at least proved to myself that we do care. I think Israel is a very traditional country. I think the overwhelming majority of Jews, by the way, keep Passover also, at least in terms of not eating leavening, bread, rolls, at least in terms of a Passover Seder. So I think he's wrong. But at any rate, that's what he said.
Did it tear your heart in two? You know what, I know you, and I know the spirit with which you went to see him, and now you're being sent away, and all the dream has been dashed in that conversation. What do you do with that, Shlomo? Where have you gone since then? But that was in the 1990s, 1993, 94.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
This is 2014. This is 20 years later. Where are you in relationship to that event? Have you said to yourself, tragically, that event is for the Palestinian a frozen moment? If I were to see him today, the answer would be the same. Do you see any movement at all of a positive nature, or for all I know, you see it that he would have been worse to you now, 20 years later, than he was then? But what is your experience? And again, you come from this out of Efrat, and it's not like, Efrat is, if anybody who's been to Israel, and I hope everybody who goes to Israel goes to Efrat, and the last time we were there, we brought a whole group and sat with you, and most American Jews have no clue what an Efrat is, or Ma'ale Adumim is, or what a Karnei Shomron is. They have no idea. And it's this gorgeous suburban community out of Jerusalem. It is like Stamford, Connecticut, like any town in New Jersey, like any town in Florida. And people shouldn't imagine, makeshift buildings. You have a gorgeous community there, and everything I've heard and read is that even if there were to be a two-state solution, I don't know now if we'll get there, but even if there were, Efrat is going to be within a section of what's now the West Bank that will be included inside of the formal state of Israel in a two-state compromise. So that's Efrat. At the same time, any American Jew who lands at Ben Gurion Airport and goes to Jerusalem and then says, I'd like to see the Western Wall, by going to the Western Wall, they're on the West Bank. And if they travel to see you in Efrat, they're going to be on the West Bank. I'm asking you now, it's 20 years from that moment when you were sent away. Thankfully, nothing bad happened to you, but something happened inside. Where on your own journey do you stand, and what do you think would happen if you went back there today?
I'll tell you, I think about this almost every tefillah. We're very fortunate. What does faith mean? I don't think faith means believe in God, it'll work out well. Certainly not for individuals. There's no such thing. The world is the world. I believe that God gives us freedom of choice. The Sephorno says that, and many others. Even freedom of choice to do what he wouldn't like us to do necessarily. And therefore, a great deal is up to us. And many rabbis in the Talmud teach that there's no reward for commandments in this world. There's another world of souls. I believe in that too. So, I don't necessarily believe that everything will turn out well now. But I believe with all my heart what all the prophets say, that ultimately compassionate righteousness and moral justice is going to win.
Yeah, it may take a long time.
Now, for 2,000 years, Jews have prayed for the ingathering of the exiles. I dare say, in 1946, I'm not so sure I would pray with that much kavanah. I probably would have been scratching my head and thinking to myself, if I had been older, what kind of nonsense is this? But it's happening before our very eyes. The Rambam says that at the end of the days, everyone's going to return to the true religion. The laws of Kings, 12:1. I've discovered, they discovered me actually, they wrote to me, I went to visit them, communities in Africa, a small town called Puti outside of Uganda. We now have 2 students, one from Puti and one from the Cameroons, studying, and they may even study to become rabbis in our rabbinical school. It's amazing what's happening Jewishly throughout the world. And I believe that the world will come around. And I think that the Palestinians will come around too. The Palestinians, many of them have already come around. Their leadership will change. Hopefully, they will force that change. But their leadership will change. So I remain optimistic. We had on Shivasa B'Tammuz, Tzomet Hagush, a prayer service, Ramadan, Shivasa B'Tammuz. Palestinians and Israelis praying together. I wasn't in Israel. I was involved in organizing the event, but I was here. But I understand it came off very, very well. One Arab imam whose name I can't mention publicly, but who's very close to me, I asked him, how can you still be so friendly to us Jews when you get so much propaganda from the other side? And he said to me, we watch television. We see how the Israelis live. We're not fools. We know what freedom means. And we want that freedom too. When enough Palestinians will talk like that individual, change will come about. But I believe change will come about. And I think we've done such a quantum leap today, to live today and not to believe in miracles. You have to be deaf, dumb, and blind. And therefore, I'm very optimistic.
Okay, it's remarkable to hear you say that, because certainly our viewers would not have been surprised if you'd said, yeah, I came away from that meeting and I've never had the optimism again that I had as I had when I walked those stairs and saw those horrific posters landing after landing after landing. But you've said quite the opposite. You've said, despite that, and evidently there must be experiences you've had still with the Arab population, the Palestinian population that surrounds Efrat. Something must be going on in the day-to-day interchange that you have with the Palestinians. Maybe you're still celebrating simchas, and unfortunately you're sharing moments of sadness with them.
Yes,
At one point you said to me, at one point you did say that you were very disappointed that the intifadas itself, the first and the second one, had influenced some of the Palestinians near Efrat, and where at one point people really didn't worry. There was a moment or two of anxiety. I don't know if the anxiety still exists.
No, I don't remember it. I don't remember that.
It's certainly not what you feel now.
No, it's not. I don't think. There was one incident. It's interesting. I believe it was the second Intifada, and it was Sunday Chol Hamoed Pesach, and I got a call that there was a pigua, there was an attack. We have a mini hospital, actually, an emergency medical center in Efrat now, proud, standing, very special, that caters to Arabs for free.
Most people don't know about that.
And open all night.
Nobody knows. Yeah. Go ahead.
And takes care of Palestinians as well as the Jews, but the Palestinians for free. Dr. Glick does an amazing job, very special. Yitz Glick, very special. At any rate, it was a Sunday, and we had a little bit of a medical center, but it was very little. And it was the road right beyond Wadi Nis. And someone said to me, as I was running to see what had happened in the Pikua, and there was one young fellow, Perlman. His parents owned a large grocery complex in Efrat. It looked like his intestines were out. And they took him in a stretcher. There was another fellow who had a concussion. And someone said to me, that's what your friends did in Wadi Nis. And I said, what do you mean? And apparently what had happened is that someone came, there was the dirt road from Wadi Nis, claiming to be a citizen of Wadi Nis, and that he had an appointment to see me. And they said, show papers, some kind of proof. And he immediately began walking very, very quickly towards the center of the city, and he was stopped, and then he blew himself up. At any rate, there were many doctors tending to the Palestinian and clearing the area. And I spoke to one of them who directed me to the pathologist, and I said, you know, I would like to see the person, the terrorist. That was the only real terrorist attack we had in Efrat. And thank God I lived to be at his wedding, and he lived to be at his wedding, and Baruch Hashem. And the boy with the concussion is a proud father of many children today, and everything is fine. But I said I would like to see if I can, the Palestinian, if his face is intact. He said, yes, the whole bottom part was blown away, but his face is perfectly intact. If you wait 45 minutes, I'll let you. I know everybody in Wadi Nis. When I saw that he was not from Wadi Nis, I burst out in tears. Now, I'm not a fool. I know it could be that there would be a rotten apple anywhere, but I didn't want to believe it, and I was very glad that that was not the case. Now, there is a change because they're frightened of Hamas. The whole freedom of entry and exit that I always felt going there, I don't do, not because I'm afraid, I'm really not, but it could get them into trouble. And that's really a change.
And how do you feel about Mahmoud Abbas and Fatah and the Palestinian Authority? Do you believe there is still a possibility that Mahmoud Abbas is a leader capable of making a peace agreement with the State of Israel that would implement a two-state solution?
Not a chance.
Wow.
Not a chance.
Because?
Not a chance.
Because?
Not a chance. Because there's a track record. Because with Olmert, there was a tremendous desire to make some kind of a peace treaty. And he never acquiesced. And I think the reason he never acquiesced is, I don't think he's as bad as many of the others, but he certainly is not a moderate. He certainly shares in all the jubilation when a terrorist comes home to Palestine as a major hero.
For having
killed an Israeli. And I really think that Mahmoud Abbas is afraid of his life, because there is in the Quran a clear statement that any area that once was Muslim can never be given up
to the infidel.
And if anyone does that, he will be killed. And that's what murdered Sadat. And that's what I think he's really frightened of.
But that would be true of any leader then.
Well, you had to be a Sadat. Sadat also knew about what's
So you're
in the
waiting
Quran.
for the Palestinians to have a Sadat. And you still are optimistic that can happen.
I'm sure it can happen.
You're sure it can happen.
Listen, the Gemara says, in Sanhedrin, I think Tzadichet, Tzaditet, that Bnei Banav Shel Amalek, the descendants of Amalek, taught Torah in Bnei Brak. And there's one version that says that was Rabbi Akiva. So if Amalek can do tshuva, it can happen to anybody.
Yes, there's a messianic sense in that, though. Not a sense grounded in reality. I worry for Israel. I worry for you.
Mark, I love you. But what is there about the Jewish people which is grounded in reality?
Okay, that's a good answer to me. I want you, in this area, I want one more question for you. I want to hear what you would say. It's important for America to hear what you would say. There seems to be a willingness in a small but growing sector of the extreme right in Israel to engage in violence against Arabs and even against Israeli soldiers. What do you say about that? How representative of Israel is it? Do you worry that within sort of right-wing Orthodox extremism, there could be a kind of violence which may have led to the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, which permits a Goldstein to go into a mosque and use a machine gun, which allows kids to pick up a Palestinian teen and burn him alive as they kill him? And that's what you hear now. You hear, you know what? There is a growing Israeli faction that is willing to use the violence that Israel has always, A, been able to condemn, and B, has given it a certain kind of moral superiority, and that if you rip that out from Israel, it is harmful to Israel on a global sense. What do you say?
I honestly don't think that that's the case. Remember, when I came to Israel in 1983, I think a year later, as an Oleh, I think a year later was the Machteret. And that was an interesting voice, because there were intellectuals, those who were in the Machteret. That was the underground that murdered a number of Arab mayors.
Blew them up in cars.
Blew them up in cars, right. Look, I believe very strongly that if, God forbid, that becomes close to a norm, they've won and we've lost. Those who murdered an innocent Arab boy were not zealots. They were evil Rishaim. And I don't think it's a growing phenomenon.
What do they represent in Israel?
They represent only a very fringe element.
Isn't it a prick of Israeli life? It's very, very important to say that. What a joy it is to sit with you. I love you so much.
Pleasure to sit with
you,
Mark. It
it's
really
just
is.
No, I can't tell you how wonderful it is, and how wonderful it is that you give us so much time. And I have to say, I'm going to keep chasing you, because the voice you have is unique. It needs to be heard. I want you to be heard on Shalom TV. I know how busy you are. By the way, Or Torah Stone has become fab. I mean, it's been fabulous now for how many years have you been doing this?
30
now?
years.
30 years.
Which is this our 30th anniversary.
It's an anniversary. Mazal Tov. It's just extraordinary. And you have many wonderful, extraordinary people who are making the entire yeshiva process possible, and they all get credit too, but it comes down from you. And I can't, I can't.
Wonderful,
you do. But you know, I wish you kol tuv v'hatzlacha in all you do.
Thank you very much.
But understand, I'm going to chase you all the time. You have to sit in this chair. Thank you. Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish Education in Media.